So you're telling me this is what the data is saying, but
unequivocally.
You're clearly looking at a different set of data to everyone on the mainstream media.
No, I'm not.
Why are they coming up with different conclusions?
The data that I use is freely available publicly, the same data that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change uses, the same data that CSIRO can access, the same data the Bureau of Meteorology accesses, the same data that National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration accesses, the same data that NASA's got to do.
Okay, but where's the confusion? Where's the disagreement coming from?
Here's part of the confusion. We hear that NASA is driving, NASA shows the evidence. NASA has never ever proven caused by humans. They have shown graphs showing warming, but here's where their graphs come from. They've distorted their graphs. A man called James Hanson was head of NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies, a tiny group within NASA itself. So they apply the NASA mantle to their little studies. It's not.
Claim credibility.
Exactly. Right. Scientific credibility. Then when you have a look at NASA itself, a lot of their scientists, a lot of their engineers, their astronauts, their administrators, their managers decry James Hanson and what he's done to corrupt the NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies. When you look at the actual measurements that NASA Goddard Institute of Space Studies and James Hanson and now the current director Gavin Schmidt put out, the temperature data has been doctored. Remember I said that the 1910 was very low in temperature. Mm-hmm. That was after our longest ever drought, so we don't get the record showing our longest ever drought. So they claim any drought now is unusual, whereas it's not. So then they show the temperature rising to 1930s and then dropping for 40 years and then rising. What they've done, and then we see the 1998 spike and the 2016 spike. Well, you remember the celebrity called Brian Cox. He was on Q&A. The ABC used that, okay? Now, what he showed was a graph showing alarming increases in temperature, purporting to show that. I pointed out right there in front of him, and he got so agitated he started getting nervous. I pointed out straight in front of him, first of all, what they've done is the 1930s, and then the decrease, they've reduced the 1930s temperature. So now instead of having an increase and a decrease, they have a steady increase because they've decreased the 1930s. They've dropped past temperatures. And then the 1998 temperature increased. They removed that altogether. But only until last year they used to show that. But now that we've got the 2016 increase, if they showed the 1998 increase and the decrease and then the 2016 increase and decrease, it would look odd. So they removed the 1998 El Nino altogether so that then you've gone from this to this to this.
So they're actually manipulating, distorting, and corrupting the data.
And what's more, when I wrote, I've held the CSIRO accountable, and I'll tell you more about them later, the chief scientists of our country, the Bureau of Meteorology, major universities, all 9 academics who have been pushing this nonsense around our country and justifying carbon dioxide taxes. All government departments are pushing this. I've held them all accountable. Not one of them, most have responded, not one of them has provided any empirical evidence showing that our carbon dioxide affects climate in any way. Not one. I've recently been holding the Gavin Schmidt, the director of NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies, accountable. And I said to him, I put up some data and said, show me where I'm wrong. He came back and said that they couldn't explain certain data because they rely upon National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The Trump administration loved that because what it shows now is that whereas they used to say, NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies used to say we have 4 data sets around the world. We've got the Met Office, we've got NOAA in America, we've got NASA, and we've got a Japanese. Here's NASA now saying that those 2 sets are the same. And we've known for a long while that the 4 so-called independent data sets are one data set. So when people say NOAA says this, NASA says this, the Met Office says this, the Japanese say this, it's nonsense. One corrupted, manipulated data set says that. And when you look at the satellite data, there's no warming. And when you look at the corrupted data, if you look at the raw data, it shows there's nothing unusual. So even their own data shows that.
What I want to know is, how come you're the only one calling this out?
I'm not. The majority of scientists by far are saying what I'm saying. Now, when we look at the consensus, we find that that's been cobbled together, fabricated by people like John Cook at the university I went to, University of Queensland. Naomi Oreskes put in a fabricated claim of consensus. So if we look at the figures that John Cook and his co-authors put in at the University of Queensland, which President Obama then circulated through Twitter several years ago, Cook's study uses a study of about 11,000. I've got very round figures here. I can go to the exact figures. I can show you anytime. I've documented this on the internet. And this study was done by statisticians, investigators, and climate scientists from around the world.
Just so you know, anything that you want to reference us for viewers to look further for themselves, we'll put in links underneath each video
I can give you
that we upload,
links.
so they can do their own research. They can verify and validate all the data that you're offering.
Remind me and I'll give you
We don't
links.
want anybody to take just our word for it.
Good. We're talking about the, that's right, the 97% consensus. So what Cook did was he looked at 11,000 odd papers. And they supposedly mentioned climate. And he chucked out all but 4,000 on some basis, we don't know. So that left about 4,400. Then he eliminated that down to about 40. But in the process of eliminating it down, he came to around about 60 odd. I can't remember these exact figures, I'm sorry. But what he said was that of those that were left, that was 97%. But if you actually look at the ones that are left, it's 0.3% of the original 11,000. So in other words, that's right, he fabricated the claim that warming. He merged the claim that warming papers, the papers that claim warming and papers that claim catastrophic warming, were one and the same, which was a nonsense for a start. So if you look only at the papers that claim unusual catastrophic warming, there were 41 papers. 41 papers out of 11,000 odd is 0.3%. And here's the thing, Dave. Not one of those papers claiming catastrophic warming has any empirical evidence showing that we're causing it. John Cook's fabrication is a complete fabrication. It is a disgrace. It's been debunked. It's not science. It's a nonsense. So the other studies that claim 97% consensus, strange, they all end up 97%. Not one of them has any scientific methodology to it. Not one of them is seen as scientific, but some of them have been peer-reviewed. And not one of them has any backing of empirical evidence. And the only thing that decides science is empirical evidence. End of story.
Talk to me about peer review.
Peer review has been corrupted. I recently heard of the Lancet journal in Britain, which is a medical journal in Britain.
Very famous, very credible.
Yeah. Apparently they published a paper, I haven't read it, but they published a paper saying that at least 50% of scientific papers have significant doubts about them. We know that there's plagiarism going on. We know there's corruption of data going on, corruption of methodology. And the IPCC itself, when they did their studies, supposedly, and 2001, now let's try and capture this all. In 2001, they produced a study from Mann et al., which Mann, Bradley and Hughes, I think, and that showed the supposedly catastrophic warming. That was concocted and has been debunked by scientists and by climate scientists. The UN put that up in 2001 and splashed it all around the world. Catastrophic warming. When that was torn apart, they just quietly withdrew it. They don't publish it anymore. But it got the headlines around the world that we've got catastrophic warming. So there's no science there. In 2007, they relied upon computer models, projections. Those models themselves have been shown to be hopelessly wrong. And in 2013, when you look at the IPCC's latest report, it actually admits the models are wrong. And worse, for scientists, we don't know why they're wrong. So if you haven't got a clue as to why they're wrong, but you know they're wrong, why are you still pushing this nonsense? Now then we look at, so the IPCC also in 2001, 2007 and 2013 had each of those reports had only one sole chapter claiming warming and attributing it to our carbon dioxide. One chapter. In 2001 it was chapter 12, in 2007 it was chapter 9, in 2013 it was chapter 10. Each of those chapters has no empirical evidence showing that our production of carbon dioxide affects climate.
On what basis do they make that conclusion?
It's a politically driven thing. The summary for policymakers...
Didn't they even have a pretense of a basis in the chapter?
In 2001, the scientists came up with the report saying there's no evidence. Ben Santa, one of their so-called scientists, changed the scientific report at the last minute, and it went up to the summary for policymakers, and they wrote that the science says that it's warming. One person changed it. No peer review, nothing. Contradicted the peer review. In 2007, each year, the summary for policymakers, which is the thinned down version, it's very sensationalized. It goes around the world to all the politicians and the media. It says that we're causing the warming. It's not a scientific document, it's political. And the actual instructions, as quoted by Tim Ball, a Canadian climatologist, probably the best in the world, he has shown that the IPCC summary for policymakers is written on a political guidelines, and if the political summary contradicts the science is changed to suit the politics. So what we've got now is policy-driven science, which is not science, rather than science-driven policy. If you then look at Kevin Rudd, he said there are 4,000 scientists running around in white lab coats saying that we're warming. When you look at the actual data, and a man in Melbourne has done a phenomenal job on this, John McLean, using the IPCC's own figures. In 2007, in the fourth assessment report, which is what Kevin Rudd was saying, 4,000 scientists, it actually boils down to only 5 academics endorsed the claim of human carbon dioxide affecting climate, and none of them had any evidence whatsoever. So the 4,000 scientists consensus from Kevin Rudd boils down to 5 people and no evidence. The 97% consensus boils down to 0.3 and no empirical evidence. It's complete concoction.
Let's talk about, we've got policy to talk about. What's One Nation's policy on climate?
Scrap all climate policies to do with this claim of global warming caused by human carbon dioxide. Scrap them all and get back to cheap, affordable energy.
Yep.
We have...
Nuclear?
We don't discuss that. We just said cheap, affordable energy. And we know that the cheapest...
Are you for it or against it?
I've got doubts about waste disposal, but there are more and more people coming up with the realization that that can be done safely. But I've yet to be convinced. But I'm open to being convinced. I'm open to anything that advances humanity. We know that South Australia, for example, which is now a basket case because it's gone away from coal and gas, we know that South Australia has a huge proportion of the world's recoverable uranium, and we should be using, be considering the use of uranium.
What about renewable energies? How do we or don't we?
I don't call them renewables, they're intermittents. They're intermittents because they're intermittent. Solar energy is far too expensive. Wind energy is even more expensive and damaging.
So let the free market come up with a solution?
Exactly, which is what it's done for the last 160 years. And on top of that, and given us enormous benefits. But on top of that, it's not just price that's important, it's reliability, it's stability, and it's security, and it's environmental responsibility and environmental friendliness. Coal meets all those criteria. So we know that carbon dioxide from a coal-fired power station has no impact on the climate. We know that supercritical coal-fired power stations these days, and we've got some in Queensland and in Australia, we know that they don't produce particulates, they're scrubbed out. They don't produce sulfur dioxide, they're scrubbed out. They don't produce nitrous oxide, which are the real pollutants, they're scrubbed out. They just, when you burn a hydrocarbon, which is what coal and oil are, hydrocarbons consist of carbon atoms and hydrogen atoms. When you burn them in oxygen, the carbon combines with the oxygen to form carbon dioxide, CO2, and H2O, hydrogen oxide, if you like. So carbon dioxide is essential for life on Earth. Water is essential for life on Earth. And what you see coming out of most chimneys in the developed world with a modern power station with the right pollution scrubbing equipment is water vapor, and you can't see the carbon dioxide coming out because it's colourless, odourless, tasteless. So yeah, coal, hydro energy, we should be building hydro plants, we should be damming rivers up north, sending the water down south. Australia doesn't have a shortage of water. We have a shortage of water in certain places at certain times because we don't have a very strong annual cycle in Australia. in terms of rainfall, because we can have 7-year droughts, we can have 6-year droughts, 4-year droughts. In North America, their food bowl is phenomenal. Every year, down comes the rain at the same time.
Yeah.
We don't have that, so we have to have a longer period. We need more dams in this country, we need more hydro plants in this country, we need more coal-fired power stations in this country. Solar energy is very expensive. It's coming down, which is great. I'd love to see solar thrive one day, but not at the moment. So even for a given amount...
Not at the cost of the taxpayer with no benefit.
No, and what's worse, Dave, is that we've now got Peter Beattie. That man put in place a 60 cent per kilowatt hour, what did he call
Rebate?
it? Rebate, thank you very much. And in effect, what was happening is poorer people who can't afford the solar panels are subsidising through higher electricity charges the people who could afford the solar panels. So we've got the poor paying for subsidising the rich. But even worse, because now power prices are going up so high, it's now a highly regressive tax on the poor. So the Greens, who are anti-human, anti-environment, anti-science, the Greens are now subsidising the destruction of the poor in this country and leveraging a highly regressive tax and impost on the poor in this country.
I've got another policy question for you. We'll save that for the next segment.
Okay.